I'm Michael McMullan, and this is the first episode of the WPBSA Podcast, official podcast of snooker's world governing body. In each episode, we're going to go back to a moment in time from the game's history, and today it's the 2001 Masters, not just reflecting on the event itself, but also on how it fitted in with everything else going on in snooker around that time. And joining us for these reflections are two players who have particularly strong memories of that week. Shaun Murphy, who was there as an 18-year-old. Hello, Shaun.
Hello.
Good to have you with us. And Fergal, of course, who so nearly won it. Fergal O'Brien, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good to be here, Michael. Thank you.
Let's start with you then, Fergal. Obviously, we'll talk in detail about your campaign, that memorable week in 2001. But overall, in a sentence or two, what comes into your head in terms of memories when people mention the 2001 Masters?
Well, gutted was the first reaction. Obviously, I only recently just seen the footage after, and you can see just when they're getting ready, the presentation ready, I have this lost, haunted look in the distance. I don't know where I am, but it's not a good place. So obviously I was gutted, but as I always say, any disappointment I had, or even emotion when Paul died, I basically in sense of don't really think of it at all. And as I always say, it was the right. If by my time again, it was the right result, because obviously the way it worked out, Paul obviously winning one of the other years, they played for the Paul Hunter Trophy. So in the grand scheme of things, it was the right result. So anything, any resentment, disappointment, I had to let go, because how could you begrudge him that when I said he was 27, apart from being number 4 in the world, married, just a 1-year-old daughter, and as I always say, my daughter's 23, so I've got to see her grow up. So, how could I possibly harbour any more disappointment?
Yeah, and of course, we'll talk about that memorable final and the other matches you played. But Shaun, what about you? It was all very different for you, also exciting, 18 years of age. I seem to remember you turned up with bleached hair at the time. So what was it like for you that week?
Yeah, incredible, really. I mean, apart from the bleached hair, I think we all had an Eminem phase, didn't we? I mean, Fergal, you must have had an Eminem phase in your life at some stage. No?
One day I think I went out without combing my hair. That was about extravagant as I got.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So the Eminem phase aside, it was obviously my first dip, into an event of that stature. I'd never played in an arena like the Conference Centre. The standout memory for me was just that, the tables seemed so alien, from what I'd played on before in qualifiers, the Benson and Hedges Championship, which had got me there in the first place. The tables were just completely alien, and felt like a complete fish out of water, for most of the event. But an amazing experience. Very proud to have played at the Conference Centre. It was great to look back on.
Okay, well, of course, I'm Eminem, so I've had that phase going all through my entire life. But let's talk about where we were at that time in the game. And we'll come to you about this, Fergal, because you had turned professional actually slightly before that class of 92 that we always talk about. You were on the tour a year before them. And I think by around the time of the 01 Masters, we'd got to a point where they were well past being young pretenders. They were now the snooker establishment.
Yeah, exactly. The top 4 was probably 3 of them and Hendry. When I kind of first came on the scene, early 90s, the top 4 was Hendry, Davis, Parrott, and
Jimmy.
And that had kind of passed. This is obviously Hendry was still there. O'Sullivan, Williams, and Higgins, they were still there. They were, as we turned out, they still had more to do, but they were the top 4. I remember at the time that was their 4 matches, which seemed to be, on the likes of the BBC, they're nearly on a row, so they were always the main matches. So that top 4 was becoming a big thing.
We talked there, Shaun, about the class of 92, and Higgins and Williams had both been world champion by then. But of course, we're talking early 2001, and Ronnie O'Sullivan had not yet become world champion. But it was probably around that time that he was finally starting to show himself, Shaun, to be someone who could win on a consistent basis.
Yeah, consistency wasn't a word you would have used with O'Sullivan around that time, I don't think. And this was obviously way before the much talked about joining of forces with Ray Reardon, and he was still very raw. Just on his given day, he could obviously wipe anyone away. And burst on the scene, of course, winning the UK Championships. And then, if you plot his, career path from there to winning the world title eventually, very up and down. Didn't look a certainty for a long time. But some of those early matches that he played at the Masters, I remember one particular match where he blitzed Nigel Bond, and he was just making breaks, running around the table, potting them off the lampshades. John Virgo in commentary, eulogizing about it. It was just an incredible performance, and he seemed to go from becoming from a kind of a. I mean this in the way, I mean this in a positive way. He went from almost an exhibition style player to a very, very serious force in the game very, very quickly. And it was around, the turn of the millennium, around that 2001, 2002 period. And yeah, obviously, he's gone on to have a fairly decent career.
Still going strong after all these years. And as you say, he hadn't really been consistent up until that time, but that was the season that he won, I think, 6 events and became world champion, as we'll talk about. But one event he didn't win, Fergal, was the UK Championship. Now, that's a tournament you might remember very well because you were 7-2 down in that season's UK against Matthew Stevens, I think it was, and ended up winning the match by 9 frames to 8. But do you remember anything about the rest of that tournament? Higgins beat Williams in the final, played so well, and he was someone who had already achieved so much, Higgins, but you just knew he was going to be around for a very, very long time because really, even by then, we already knew he was going to become one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, funny, I had forgotten about the Matthew Stevens game, but actually I remember a few years ago in Germany talking to Matthew Stevens, he said, my greatest ever win and my biggest ever disappointment were against you. Obviously that time, 7-2 up, and I beat him 9-8. And then he beat me in, I can't remember what year, maybe 11 or 12 in the World Championships qualifier.
Yes.
I was 60 ahead, and he made a great break and tended to win. So I wouldn't have known Matthew particularly or overly close. Always got on, it wasn't overly close, but there was that kind of relationship. I said his best and worst matches were against me. Yeah, but at that time Higgins just looked more consistent. Again, when I first in the early 90s, I was over in Scotland playing in the club in Stirling with John Higgins at the start. He was there as well. I remember seeing him at like 16 or so, and he was deadly. He knew what was coming, the full all-round game. Basically, I think because he was practicing with Hendry and McManus, so he had all the break building and mentality from Hendry, and he had all the tactical knowledge, professionalism, discipline from Alan. So it was like a perfect combination. And obviously kept that through. He always looked like he was more going to have a longer, more sustained maybe career, whereas Ronnie was at that time, mid-90s, went missing a little piece and was very ragged in himself and in his game. And was only really, not even so much, Shaun made a good point, when he won the Worlds in 2001, but I really started thinking of Ronnie as the greatest from 04 onwards. By that time, he'd kind of changed his cue action. His cue action was a lot better. Like everybody raves about the 147 and 520, and it is phenomenal. But it's an awful cue action. Awful. It's just like literally like a pool player. Now it takes some amount of talent, but as he said himself, he wasn't winning any world titles with that cue action ever. So he had to kind of break it down, much more kind of methodical. Obviously he's still very fluent. And then when he had that better cue action, more control he had. And then the tactical knowledge with Ray. So really from 04, he started to really become, obviously he was world champion, world number one, but it was from then he really became, that's when you're really seeing the greatness that he was just then kind of separated himself.
And Shaun, just something Fergal alluded to there. If you'd said to people at that time, you've got Higgins, you've got O'Sullivan, they'd been compared since they were kids before they were even on the tour. If you'd asked someone at that time, which of these guys is going to have the better career in the long run, it would have been very hard to find anyone who would have said O'Sullivan.
Yeah, and I don't think that's unfair. I think that's, that's looking back, we don't want to look back through rose-tinted spectacles at all. I think that's very fair. John Higgins was, in a different sphere at the time. He was looking at a completely different package. You could never question O'Sullivan's talent, the raw, natural talent that was obviously there. You couldn't question that. But could he harness it? Could he polish the diamond? He was a very rough diamond at the time. And could he polish those edges and harness that natural talent that was obviously there for everyone to see. But, he did blow very hot and cold. But he just seemed to become a different person. When he did finally win that championship, it was as if he became better when he realised how good he was himself. And of course, he's gone on to become the greatest of all time.
There's one event we do have to talk about before we move on from early 2001. It was the Nations Cup, Fergal, and you were on the Republic of Ireland team that got to the final. Now, I'm not going to ask you yet again about the incident where you got warned at an inappropriate moment, let's say, about slow play. But just being part of a team like that and all the camaraderie and being involved in a final of what was for a few years quite a big event, was that something that you remember helping you going into the Masters in terms of confidence and belief?
Okay. Yeah, even though we got to the final, if anything, I was going in a little bit of a downer because of what had happened in the final, being warned for slow play. And as I said, you could argue whether or not I should have been warned. But it's more so the fact that Alan Chamberlain did it shouting across the table, which obviously brought the crowd involved. And then as I walked around to me, he said, "Come on, hurry up, TV finishes at 5, which probably wasn't the best advice. And I said, if he'd come over and warned me quietly, fair enough. So and then I ended up losing that frame, which is a pivotal frame against John Higgins, and we ended up losing. So, as I said, it was on a bit of a down, probably a bit embarrassed what happened, a little sort of quiet and reserved and into myself. So, I had no great expectations going into that tournament. But I said, in itself, the Nations Cup and playing with Ireland, playing with Ken and Mick, and the buzz of that while you were playing and the others watching it used to be great footage of nearly the cameras in the dressing room or the players lounge to the players and their reaction. So that was great. Anytime I played with the team is always great. And once we got to the final, the gloss for me had been taken off because I said it was just a bitter pill to swallow with what had happened.
So if anything, it dampened your feelings going into the Masters. But Shaun, you were in there as one of the wild cards, because now we know it's the top 16, but this was an era when there were 2 wild cards in the Masters as well. Now, basically, they brought this in because Alex Higgins dropped out of the top 16 and they wanted to get him in there. He was long gone off the scene by 2001, but they still had that system. One wild card was picked basically on things like popularity or how your season had gone, but the other came from the Benson and Hedges Championship. And there was only one place available, so you had to actually win the event. It was a tournament for anyone who wanted to enter, who wasn't in the top 16. And you won it. You beat Stuart Bingham in the final. So how important was that for you in your career to come through a field like that and end the week as the winner?
Well, it was obviously a great moment. I mean, it was the World Championships in 2005 is often referred to as my first pro win. But of course, my actual first pro win was the Benson and Hedges Championship. Way back in 01, actually maybe it was 2000.
Late 2000, yeah.
Yeah, and I beat Stuart in the final, as you say. I was a long way behind in that final and came back to win. There's a few funny stories around that final, but the funniest thing happened in the semi-final against Mark Davis. And of course, you can imagine the whole tour, bar the top 16, decamped to this snooker club. This was in Malvern, and it was a beautiful setting. This club was turned into a makeshift world snooker venue for the week. And, there was hundreds of players there, like knocking each other out to whittle the field down. Get to play Mark Davis in the semis. It's my first experience of anything of that nature. And playing in front of a live crowd as well in like a private room in the club that they'd created. And I slaughtered Mark Davis, absolutely slaughtered him. And halfway through, I think what turned out to be the last frame, there were these 2 elderly gentlemen sat on the front row. Now, they were both deaf and couldn't whisper between them to save their life. And I potted a crazy long red, which had already, I suppose, started to become a bit of a hallmark of my game. And I think I was leading 5-1 at the time or something like that. And this old fella nudged his mate next to him. He went, "Here, Fred." He said, "This is just unfair." He said, "He's much better than the other guy." Wow. It was really uncomfortable, because it was a really small, close-knit room. Very uncomfortable, but great memories. Obviously, had no idea what to expect. I'd been to the conference centre a couple of times as a young child. I've talked openly over the years about my first trip to the Crucible, chasing Steve Davis up the famous street there outside stage door. No such stories from my first few trips to the Masters, except I remember saying to my friend John, who took me as a 12, 13-year-old boy, I remember saying to him, do you think I'll ever get to play here? Do you think that dream will ever come true? And a few years later, it did.
Well, I'm going to remind you of one thing that happened that week, Shaun, something you said after the match. And I'm not saying this to embarrass you at all, because I know you speak openly about how you cringe at some of the things you used to say. It's not too bad anyway, but I think it was after the first match against Marco Fu, you said, at the age of 8, I told my dad that I wanted to be the best player in the world. And the last 10 years have been spent preparing for today. It was a big thing to say as an 18-year-old, but yes, as you've said, maybe you were a bit too outspoken in those days, but it shows that you never lacked confidence, you never lacked belief, and you certainly never lacked ambition.
Well, I was certainly good at pretending that I had a lot of belief and a lot of self-confidence. That's what I was very good at. If they were giving out BAFTAs, they might have given one to me around that time because, whilst to the rest of the world, I might have shown this very confident, gobby, mouthy teenager. I was actually quite insecure and quite nervous and quite, actually quite an introvert. And I know those two things don't go together. And I know what a mix that does sound like. But it was a good act. And I think sometimes I over-egged the pudding, trying to convince everyone else that I actually was this blustering, confident young man who believed he could take on the world. In fact, that wasn't true. And I was under pressure from certain people in my life. I was cajoled into saying things I didn't want to, it was a tough period, and it's a period I look back on, slightly embarrassed when comments like that are repeated. But that ultimately was my story, and whilst I'm embarrassed about it, part of it was true. We'd worked very, very hard as a family and as a team. If it's not too, silly to use a word like that, we put a lot into it. And I'm sure Fergal would echo that, in terms of your journey as a professional sports person. It's not just your it's not just your effort. There's a lot of other people who put effort into it as well. And that moment of reward getting to play at the Masters in 2001 as a wild card was a big moment. And of course, it served to whet the appetite to try and get there again.
And it was Stephen Hendry who knocked you out then in the next round. But what a match it was for you, because you were 4-1 up, Shaun. Now, let's look at that in terms of all the realities of it. You were 18 years of age with your bleached hair, as we said. You were playing Stephen Hendry, who had still been the reigning world champion less than a year earlier. And of course, he owned the Wembley Conference Centre in those days. He had won the tournament 6 times already. And you were 4-1 up against him. What thoughts are going through your head at a moment like that?
Well, I just want to make a point about the bleached hair, and this is the last comment I'll make about it. I think as an 18-year-old, I think as an 18-year-old, that's the only time you can get away with bleaching your hair. Neil Robertson, if you are listening to this podcast, stop it. Leave it. No, but in all seriousness, being sat there, I beat Marco Fu in the wildcard match in the prelim the day before. And I remember vividly having an out-of-body experience, sat in my chair opposite Stephen Hendry at 4 frames to 1 ahead. And Stephen had an army of fans at the time. And one of them was a pretty devout fan, and he was sat behind him in the front row, screaming abuse at Stephen. Pull your act together, get your head out in the game and all this. Stephen sat there with his head in his hands. And I remember looking at the small, tiny scoreboard that was embedded in the set that you could only see from our seated position. And it said, Shaun Murphy, who the hell's he, 4. Stephen Hendry, God, 1. From that moment, I scored a total of 15 points. And I completely fell apart. Yeah. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fluency that I'd shown to win the championship, to qualify for the tournament. Then I had 2 centuries, played really well against Marco Fu in the prelim. I just couldn't bring myself to beat Stephen. I couldn't do it. I completely bottled it.
Spot on with your memory. It was exactly 15 points in those next 5 frames, all of which Stephen won. But let's come back to you, Fergal. I want to talk to you about Jimmy White and Ronnie O'Sullivan, because they actually played each other. Jimmy had come through that wildcard round. He'd beaten Joe Swale quite comfortably to get there. He played O'Sullivan and beat him. And it was the first sellout we'd actually had at the Conference Centre outside of the final since 1983. There has never been anything, and never will be anything, Fergal, quite like Jimmy against Ronnie playing each other at the Masters. And it wasn't the only time we saw it.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly pair of them very popular, but also them playing obviously in London just seemed to add it to it as well. Yeah, very noisy. And probably you had to probably go back to, apart from those, to maybe the Alex Higgins days. And the same again, I would have seen it younger when I was in Goffs as well in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a different atmosphere, a different feel. When probably any one of those playing, but particularly then if they're playing each other, you just didn't know. No, there was just a level of expectancy and excitement that there wasn't with any other player.
And Shaun, let's talk then about Jimmy's next match with you, because he then played Stephen Hendry in the quarterfinals and pushed him hard. And that was completely different because, as Fergal said there, Jimmy and Ronnie both so popular in London. But if you were an outsider playing against one of those at the Wembley Conference Centre, it was so tough. And it actually affected Hendry a couple of times towards the end of that match. That really was a whole extra layer of challenge, trying to play one of those guys at Wembley.
Yeah, it was a challenge that, I didn't really have, certainly against your Jimmys and O'Sullivans and people like that. I think even Davis, didn't he say that playing Higgins at Wembley, it was like an away tie?
Yeah.
It's Davis from Essex, from the London area. He's playing Higgins on his home patch, and he's second favourite. It's incredible, isn't it? But it's not something I ever experienced. I think I might have attended the Conference Centre as a boy, in one of the times that Jimmy played. And it was just, the crowd could be vicious. But I think Stephen, I wouldn't want to put words into his mouth, but hasn't Stephen gone on to say in his later years that he used to use that as motivation? That he used to want to stick it up every single member of the audience, and he just used that to his best. That particular match, he went on to win 6-4, which I suppose would have been one of their closer games, around that period of time. But, I don't think Stephen needed anyone to write his, interval dressing room motivational speech. But if he did, I think the crowd at the Conference Centre probably wrote several of them for him. What do they do? You want to, never kick the hornet's nest. And I suppose if Jimmy could have his time back, he might send a little word out to his mates in the crowd just to calm it down a little bit, because I think it just upset Stephen, and he used to use it as motivation.
So Hendry was through then to the semi-finals, where he would play Paul Hunter, and Hunter had come through against his good friend Fergal, Matthew Stevens, in the opening round, and Matthew, of course, was the defending champion. He was 3-1 up in the match. And then Hunter just blew him away with 3 big breaks in no time at all in the next few frames, and went on from there to win that match. That was something he was so good at, wasn't it? As you were to find out later, as we'll discuss, he could just turn around a match, Paul, so quickly. You'd barely even notice him doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, particularly in the final, even like in the first session, like I was 6-2 up, but it was bad. It wasn't good stuff at all. He could have easily been 6-2 up himself. Certainly the first few frames were scrappy, one on the pink or black or something. And then even certainly at 7-3 as it ended up, you couldn't possibly have foreseen what was coming, because he looked down, and if anything, I was even conscious, I think the week or two before, he'd lost in the Welsh Open final to Ken, 9-3.
Ooh, yeah.
And again, as I always say, we're going to talk about the final. I was 7-3 up and I missed an easy red with the rest. I just needed red and black. It was the last red. I think if I pot the black, I go 8-3, and I think I win 10-4, 10-5, 10-6. Prices are very grand. But obviously from that, goes 7-4. He did ton 7-5. We did an interval then, but I remember feeling calm enough, grand 7-5, okay. Then he'd another ton 7-6, and I can clearly remember I made an 80 break to go 8-6, and kind of thinking, right, well, look, that'll soften your cough now. But again, he went ton 80 to go 9-8, and I can still remember like making those clearances, and it was just so noisy. I can remember like being in the chair and he'd be about to pot the black on another 100 break, and literally actually saying to him, just wait for the noise. And as soon as the black hit the back of the leather, the roar was unbelievable. But I said, obviously the last couple of frames that we talked about, but it was an amazing burst. But that was the thing, that you couldn't see it. And probably that's similar with Matthew Stevens. It wasn't like he was close to form. He was like he was badly out of form, and it's literally like the flick of a switch, came a totally different player. Sometimes you can be ahead of a player, even have a lead, and you still feel no, he's playing well, no complacency here or anything like that. But Paul just looked like, nearly, it wasn't his day again. He was carrying a hangover from the previous final, and here we go again. That kind of mentality, but with the swing of one frame, totally transformed.
Yeah, he was amazing, Paul, looking back. And Shaun, just going back to that match earlier on that we were talking about, where Paul knocked out the defending champion, Matthew Stevens, a real low moment of that week. I remember, I think it was the Friday night, and someone came into the press room and informed us that Matthew's dad, Morel, who we all knew because he used to spend a lot of time in the press room, had passed away. And we've got to remember as well, Matthew was still so young at that time. Do you think that tragedy, losing his dad at quite an early age, was something that really set Matthew back in his career?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. Same thing happened to another young player called David Gray, who, was a ranking event winner himself and lost his father when he was a very young man. These were guys that I'd known from the junior scene. Of course, there was quite an age difference between David and I, and Matthew and I. But I remember Morel. I'm sort of old enough now to go back, almost like that saying about, you remember the guys who shook Sinatra's hand. I'm one of the few that remember, these guys' fathers, as I say, David Gray's father, Matthew's father, Mark Selby's father. These were all very, very important people in their lives, and just were big driving forces, big supporters. And all of that aside, it was your dad. And somebody who in your life, as a bloke, your dad should be your best mate. And I think certainly for David Gray, certainly for Matthew Stevens, that was the role that their fathers played. Obviously, young men with a lot of money in their pocket, their fathers would have kept them on the straight and narrow a little piece, good advice at the right time, big management figures looking after their interests. So to lose somebody so pivotal at such a formative part of your life is tragic. And, it probably doesn't get spoken about enough with Matthew, probably for good reason, because it would drag up so many upsetting memories. But I would put that as a reason. People talk, and it makes me slightly uncomfortable, if I'm honest. People talk about Matthew Stevens having underachieved. He had a wonderful career.
Sure.
A wonderful career. But he could have achieved more. He didn't maximise his potential. And who knows, had he not have suffered the tragedy of losing his best mate, his dad, all wrapped up into one, maybe we'd be sat here talking about Matthew Stevens as one of the best players of all time.
Yeah, and still on the tour now, of course, and still a dangerous opponent to anyone he comes up against. But after Paul Hunter had knocked him out of that Masters, Fergal, he went on then to beat Peter Ebdon in the quarterfinals, then played that semi-final against Hendry and beat him. And he said afterwards, I've beaten the defending champion and I've beaten someone who's won it 6 times here before. So of course I can win it. And I think that line actually sums up Paul in a way, because he didn't try to talk himself up or talk his opponents down or anything. He just spoke honestly about how he saw things. And he had obviously taken a lot of confidence from those wins. And that's what he was like. He was full of confidence, Fergal, without ever trying to talk anyone else down.
Yeah, no confidence. And it's more like kind of quietly, nothing arrogant about him. No kind of airs or graces or edge, or just wouldn't be consciously thinking, well, I'll say this for an effect. We'll just literally, ask him a question and he answered honestly. I think that was part of his appeal. And even when he went on and won a couple of them, even obviously won 3 Masters then, never, when he won or lost, it was the same. Obviously, apart from winning, you wouldn't say when he won all 3, as great as wins as they were, all comebacks, that in any way he gloated with the wins. And obviously by the same token, then if you take the other side of the scale, when he lost in 03, the semi-final to Ken, when he had like 15-9 up to lose, like it's a horrendous defeat. Let's not get away from it. But I mean, he took it as gracious as any person possibly could. And I think that was part of his, I suppose it was a strength, but also part of his appeal, that there was no great, win or lose, he'd be off out and he'd still be the same guy, you know what I mean? Apart from the actual enjoying watching him play, because obviously he had a nice style,
And let's stay with you, Fergal, because we have to talk about your campaign. And in the first round, you played Mark Williams. Now, you'd played at the Conference Centre the year before, gone out in the first round. So this was the first match you'd ever won there. And I remember you saying afterwards, special to beat the world number one here. And it really was quite a landmark to achieve. Your first ever win at the Masters is against the world number one and reigning world champion. Do you remember much about that match?
I remember it was 6-5, and maybe there was one or two frames I could have, should have won, and then it came back. I think I made a decent enough break in the last, maybe a 50 odd. And it was a big win. Obviously, Mark, as I said, was world number one, world champion, and in the Masters, that I was well aware of as a kid growing up the significance of the Masters and playing Wembley Conference. And even the previous year, I was 4-1 up on Stephen Lee and lost 6-4. So yeah, to win any match, But I more just remember there was a kind of, I think even before that match, I was due. Alan Chamberlain might have been due to referee, and they deliberately changed it just to avoid any issues as such.
Because of what had happened in the Nations Cup final, yeah.
Yeah. So there was probably, I said it was more, I'm going to say calm, but more, I'm going to say in my shell kind of calm rather than a quietly confidence calm in my game. So I obviously was playing well enough, and it was a good win. So yeah, I was in, maybe I just calmed down, so my mind probably wasn't as preoccupied at getting ahead of myself. I do kind of remember that, just kind of taking it match by match and not getting ahead of myself. Where there's been other terms, maybe you get to the quarterfinals, you think you're grand, you get to the quarterfinals, all of a sudden that night you can't sleep because you're not just thinking about the quarterfinal. You think this could be my weekend, and before you know it, you go out in the next day in the quarterfinals and you played bad because you've literally got ahead of yourself. You need to plan who's going to be coming out for the final on Sunday, and how you get it. That wasn't the case. It was quite calm, and just okay, that was a great win. Yeah, okay, on to the next one. And again, I suppose probably in the fact the next one was obviously playing Ken, playing a lot at that time. And again, just the caliber of players, you couldn't get too really far ahead of yourself. They were quite calm, played well against Ken, beat him. I think it was 4-0 up and won 6-2. So it was a comprehensive win, but played well. And then that week there'd been a lot of seeds that got beaten. I suppose it was probably a bit of winning the top 16 is still a bit of a surprise. Maybe I got to the semi, and also Dave Harold, who I think he had a win against Parrott, didn't he? Was he 5-1 down? And
yeah, I'd like to talk to Shaun about that match actually, because Parrott was 5-1 up, and he missed match ball green with the rest, and things just sort of crumbled for him. And Shaun, Dave actually ended up turning that one round to win by 6 frames to 5, which was amazing against a player of Parrott's quality. But at that time, that was where we were, because we had this wonderful top echelon of the top 4, 5, 6 players. But within the top 16, top 32, by then there was probably more depth than ever. And someone like Dave, who only ever won one tournament, but what a good player he was all round.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing I would say from a player's point of view, having played at the Masters now for a few years, the table at the Masters, no matter where we play it, just seems to be like glass every time you play on it. The balls move around the table so easily. And of course, that would have suited somebody like Dave Harold, who had a very short action, a very loose grip. It was like his game was actually designed for those very reactive, very slippy, very spinny conditions. Had an incredible run that year. And it looked like, going through the scores, it looked like every time he got in, he scored. Similarly to the semi against Fergal, every time he got in, he seemed to make a break. So sometimes you get that with players whose games are just built around potential and possible playing surfaces. And looking back through the records, it's clear that Dave was very, very suited to that kind of setup.
So he played you, Fergal, in the semi-finals, and you won the match by 6 frames to 4. Now, we all knew the two of you in one of the biggest matches of your careers, it was going to be such a battle. The two of you were going to give so much, and it did go on a long time. I remember you coming in the press conference afterwards and saying, it's almost time to go back out and play the final now. But what do you remember about that contest? And in particular, as I recall it, there was a real feeling in the air of the fact that this was a match that meant so much to both of you, because to get through to a Masters final for either of you at that point in your career was just going to be so colossal.
Yeah, and I remember even with regard to, you wouldn't be overly conscious of the money as such, because you're playing in the Masters. But also, I remember even a year or two before, somebody got to the semis, so they won 2 matches. I remember where God, they won 40 grand already just for winning 2 matches, and that. And obviously, it was the same as well. You're on 40, and of course, it went up to 88 if you won. Because I remember even thinking after the final, somebody was saying, friend of mine, we're talking to friends of Dave, and after the final, talking about, he goes, yeah, he said, we were kind of, okay, he's disappointed, but look, he still had 40 grand. It's still a lot of money, which it was. So the money was a slight factor. But again, on that match, as far as I remember, it was 5-1 up. Hadn't been an amazing match. Dave didn't give up and dug his heels in. 5-4, and then the last round actually being the black. I put a good long black and came around the angles. Just about looked like it could maybe go in the middle and caught the far jaw to stay out. So I remember clearly that relief of he didn't obviously want to be 5-all, particularly if you'd have pot the black. So just it was actually more just relief. Not so much even that I got to the final, but that I hadn't lost that particular match after having the lead. So yeah, again, still, I would say, yeah, excited, but was keeping a lid on it.
So we're now in that final. You're playing Paul Hunter the next day. And Shaun, in many respects, that final was a bit like your world final that was to come a few years later against Matthew Stevens, who we were talking about, because whoever won, it was going to be a breakthrough moment. It wasn't like one of you was trying to win it for the second time. And it was very similar, that Masters final between Fergal and Paul. This was going to be a huge, huge day in someone's career. Your memory of matches from the past is remarkable. Can you remember much about the day and the feeling going into it?
Well, it was a very special moment because it was the first final I'd attended back in the days of Benson and Hedges and Gallagher's, who were their promotional company. All the competitors were invited to the final. And it was back in the days of dinner suits, and the first 2 or 3 rows of the seats were all the dignitaries and WPBSA directors, the chairman and his wife. And we were all invited as players. And I remember being sat there probably on the second row. You could have reached out and touched the table almost, watching as Paul went on this onslaught of big breaks through the second session. And that was my first real taste of that atmosphere. Fergal earlier said that the raw noise that the crowd made as Paul mounted this comeback, it was honestly, it would make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And 20 odd years later, I've very rarely played in a more raucous atmosphere than that very night. I've got a quick funny story about that because obviously I'd played in the event and played on that table, and I'm sure Fergal won't mind me saying, halfway through the deciding frame, it opened up as quite a tactical affair, obviously, for obvious reasons. Fergal was assessing this one particular shot, and some bloke shouted out from the back row in the conference centre, hurry up, I've got to be at work in the morning. It was quite funny, it broke the tension, broke the ice. It was quite funny. Didn't hear him. 15 or so years later, an exhibition down in Kent. And I walk in, and the guy who meets me at the door to meet me to do the show tells me with such pride that the table I'm going to be playing on that night was the table from the 2001 Masters.
All right.
And they had the very table. So an hour or so into the show, I start telling the story about the man who shouted out. Well, the man who shouted out worked behind the bar in this club. So they had the shouter and the table. It was like a complete homage to the Masters. But sitting there, being there, experiencing that environment for the first time, was just, well, it was magic, and it was an incredible experience. For the neutral, it was amazing to be there.
I think we need to do an episode called Shaun Murphy's Memories of Things People in the Crowd Said During Matches, because that's 3 of those stories we've had already today. Fergal,
good concentration.
What's that?
He's good concentration, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, exactly. Maybe more focus on the table required. But Fergal, let's talk about how you were feeling between sessions, because you've actually spoken earlier on in detail about how the match went. But you're 6-2 up now going into the last session of the Masters. Can you remember much about how you felt at that time?
Yeah, it was, again, still quite calm. And again, of course, in relation, we're probably going to talk about Paul's plan B, and how he spent his mid-session. But of course, typical me, obviously, Jean was over for the final. And again, me being me, of course, she obviously in the room, I kicked her out to try and have a rest or have a have a kip or whatever to prepare for the final. So remember then afterwards, it was like when you heard the story about Paul, it was going, oh, typical. I says he won and he got lucky in the afternoon. I was like, I got nothing. So yeah, that was, but no, there was no great drama with it because against 6-2, I hadn't played magnificent, but I was comfortable. I think a couple of years before when I was in the final of Plymouth, that whole day, because then it's been a late, that was a long, long day. But I definitely gone through that long day, and suppose probably winning had helped. The second final, even though it was the Masters, wasn't as big a deal. I have far more memories of the day playing the final in Plymouth than the Masters. By the Masters, my second one, it wasn't such a big deal. I wouldn't say it was absolutely flying in cock a hoop, but no, I was grand. I'd no issues, no great concerns. So it was just business as usual. There's no big drama. Remember, obviously, going out a couple of minutes before you're introduced, being aware, and you're walking out to the arena. Yeah, you're aware of the significance of that moment. But I wasn't, fearful as such.
We've gone through the details of the match, I think, in the context of earlier things we talked about. But Shaun mentioned the memory there of the atmosphere in the conference centre that night and how special it was. I know at the time you weren't thinking about that. You were, as you said at the beginning, gutted about how it had turned out. But obviously, much as you would have liked to have been a Masters champion, do you look back now and think it was a good experience to be part of? Something that is a night you still remember and will remember fondly apart from the results?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably with experience. And again, maybe after Paul passing, that becomes more relevant and more perspective. And as I always kind of say, okay, the only thing worse than losing in a final is watching somebody else lose in a final, because you still have the day. You can't get a stage where it's 9-all to the last frame, effectively last shot. And if you pot that last ball, it's been a great day. And if you lose, it's a horrendous day. It's the same experience from breakfast till 9-all. So that was a great day. And again, you'd have more regret that you didn't make more finals rather than you lost. So no, it was very special atmosphere. And again, I still think the best frame I ever won at 9-8 down after that breaks was that frame, because it was actually 40 behind in that one as well. Bearing in mind I'd hardly pot. It was nearly a moment as you're getting out of your chair. You were nearly contemplating not getting out of your chair. It felt like I'd just taken so many blows and hammering that it was like hard to, get back in. I kind of clawed my way back in it and made it pot of pink to go 9-all. So that was a great frame. On the base of where I was mentally, that I still had enough to dig out and win that frame. And obviously, if I'd had chances, obviously in the last, and if I'd have won that, then you'd really be going, God, you'd probably look back at that frame more and go, that was a great frame. You won 9-8 behind, 40 behind to dig in. But because I didn't take advantage of the chance in the last, that's kind of forgotten. But no, great day. So still now you watch a final, any final being introduced, and the handshake at the start with the trophy, and you're still buzzing. You still love to be there, still killed to be there. You'd still, if you told me you're going to get to the Welsh Open final, but you're definitely going to lose, you'd still bite your hand off, because apart from the build up of winning the matches, just on that day walking out to play a final is special. Again, you don't want to get too caught up in that. You have to win it to be anyway good or anyway positive. So no, as I said, probably regardless with Paul, it ended up being a positive. And then also after, as disappointed I was, because friends had come over from Ireland. I was up till 6 in the morning. So at 6 in the morning after the final, I was actually talking. At this point now sitting beside Paul. He's the trophy sitting beside me. They were actually on the same chair talking, and just obviously talking about the match and how great it was. So that's a very good memory as well for that kind of moment. Again, I wouldn't be overly close with Paul. He was probably younger and more fun than I was. But there was always that connection, you know what I mean, from playing. There's a bit that when you go to players in a big match, there is that kind of relationship or memory between two players. So yeah, no, I said, funny enough, I don't really look back on it too much, because in a sense, it came to terms if there was disappointment, because if we could do it again, it was the right result that Paul won for the way our lives unfortunately panned out. So, I'm more than happy in the sense of talking about it. But there would have been a time after, yeah, you wouldn't talk about it, you wouldn't think about it, because it was, a hurtful, painful memory,
I remember sitting with you actually at that get-together afterwards and being up until 7 a.m. And all these people who don't think you're a party animal, Fergal, they should have been there that night. Shaun, the Plan B story that Fergal alluded to there, just as we wrap this up now, it was the first of Paul's 3 Masters wins, all in remarkably similar circumstances. And there was a lot of coverage of that story and the comments he made the next day. I know for a fact it's a story that's massively grown legs in the years since, but all these things do. And that was the thing with Paul. Once all that had happened and he'd got those headlines and he'd had that big win, he was someone who was known quite well, even by people who weren't that into snooker. He was someone who was a genuine mainstream star.
He was, and he transcended the sport, into mainstream celebrity. And he obviously had the golden locks. He was very attractive, a good-looking lad. He had a bit of a wild side. And of course, Plan B was the story that started all of that. An amazing story. Somebody I got to know very well, through the stories that Brandon Parker used to tell me, who was managing him at the time. Of course, he would have been in the opposing corner to Fergal during that championship. Obviously, once after Paul had passed away, such tragic circumstances, Brandon and I went on to become best friends, and he managed my affairs until he passed away a few years ago as well. And some of the stories he told me about Paul were, they're not for publication anyway, that's for certain. But, I think Plan B was the start of it. He was a real character. And as I say, he was one of the true, celebrities of sport around that time. He was on every TV show, every game show. He was competing with all the other stars. And when we accepted the Helen Rollinson Award on behalf of the Paul Hunter Foundation for their contribution to sports personality in 2008, I think it was, or something like that, 9 maybe. We accepted it on behalf of the Hunter family with very, great pride, and remembered him, very, very fondly. I remember first crossing paths with him as a junior player. This, long-haired, blonde, flowing lock boy walked in from Leeds. We were just kids, like 8, 9, 10 years of age, looking up to this lad who was going to turn pro. And he was just special. He was just, he just, whatever it is, whatever that X factor is, he had it. Those things you can't teach. He was just different. And it takes a very special player to come out on that particular night. We talked about it now, the final, 6-2 behind. He had 4 tons that night, and he rode the wave. It takes a very special player to do something like that. And he was special on and off the table.
Fergal, a final thought from you, because we all know whenever the Masters finishes, all our thoughts turn to Sheffield and the World Championship, and every season finishes there. And that was the season which finished with, as we said earlier, Ronnie O'Sullivan becoming world champion for the first time. Very often when a player wins their first world title, it feels like the end of something, that they've completed their mission and become a world champion. But much like when Stephen Hendry had won it for the first time in 1990, I think, Fergal, when Ronnie won it in 01, we felt this was just the beginning. And it's turned out to be that way.
Yeah, because obviously, particularly when he won the UK so young, it was just presumed he'd be the youngest ever. That never materialised. So by 01, it was like, doubts, maybe he mightn't do it because it's still quite erratic. But once he won that, and hindsight has proved for himself the difference in that the monkey was off his back, at least he'd won 1. So now he can really probably, with that out of the way, concentrate on effectively improving, which he did. And I said, in different stages, he improved his cue, changed his cue action. Next stage was then working with Reardon, so added on the tactical, and then even another probably few years later, obviously work with Steve Peters. So the emotional side, that it's still been a bit of a weakness, even though he had a better game, better tactical knowledge, kind of that. So then he brought the 3 of them together, tied him with probably the fitness as well and the running, which obviously, apart from making him fitter, more stamina, also helped with mental state. And then, it was that amalgamation, that long journey, that he became, the greatest ever.
Well, that 2000 to 2001 season was so memorable in so many ways. The Masters was a big part of that, and both of you played your role in that memorable week in London in early 2001. Thanks so much for sharing your memories of it with us today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the WPBSA podcast, the official podcast of snooker's world governing body. You can follow our social platforms and our website for more news and features. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.